In times before iron or steel, where men fought with wood and stone, the first islands were discovered by those who wished to flee from barbaric kings, and Eoslain was founded by those long persecuted. In the ages after, where men who fought with copper and bronze, chieftains and their tribes would come to this island, and its name would be spread back to their homes, and the people that so long lived there would fashion armies to fend off the invaders from the east. Once more, so long past that those kingdoms of faraway lands did come to a new age, the age of iron and the age of steel, and the children of those invaders from so long ago would come forth to conquer what their forefathers could not secure. Grunlegarin, Stofnandi, and Grundair came to the island. With them they brought armies who rode the backs of floating dragons, and whose hands held axes of steel, and upon pedestals they brought their violent and malformed gods. The barbaric kings that the people of Eoslain had once fled had once more come to rule over their lands. Grundair brought his armies to the south of the island, where the rivers led him to the hearts of weak and petty kingdoms, and he laid claim to the lands that he burned. Grunlegarin brought his armies to the east of the island, and to the rocky lands, barren of food and burnt by the people that lived within them, and his armies were broken, and his head buried under a mound of shale. Finally, Stofnandi went to the west of the island, into the dark woods, where even the people he fought warned him not to enter, and his presence angered something. A great power worshipped and feared by those men of Eoslain, and he and his kin were laid low with a curse most foul. Those of his house would not have but sons to carry on their names, and with each king they shall break their lands between their sons, until kin would slay kin, until the curse would be broken. And so Grundair held his kingdom, and ruled it well, and his borders kept far from the lands of shale and ash that his brother had died, and further still from the dark forests that forever haunted the minds of him and his kin. And when his sons were born, he divided his land, and they fought until they had sons of their own, and the rest of the world, whose lands lay far beyond the shores of Eoslain, the old names were forgotten, and the name of Sunland arose. The Eoslain Book of Invasions, Chapter 4, The North Dragons. Chapter 1, The Princes of Gaultahas. The Jarl's sons were rowdy boys, always fighting, only sometimes with the will of their teachers. One of their teachers was a man by the name of Elvar Brosen, a fairly tall man with a well-muscled physique that he gained after years of combat training, holding up the heavy wooden shields, bearded axes, and other weapons of war iconic to Aramis and Sunland as a whole. His beard was shorter than most, blond like so many of his countrymen, and decorated with beads and plaits. Elvar Brosen was the boys' official teacher, which meant that he was in charge of training the princes in the art of warfare, combat, and castle attack and defense. Technically, he was also in charge of their other studies, finances, literacy, history, and diplomacy, but truth be told, he wasn't the sort of man who knew much of those subjects in the first place. And if Jarl Bjorn wanted them to learn this, he wouldn't have chosen Elvar to be their teacher. The eldest of the two was Hakon Bjornsson, named in honor of a minor war god within the Sturian faith. If any boy were deserving of such a name, Hakon fit the description. Despite being only 16, he stood at an impressive height, towering over foreign diplomats that sometimes came into the castle. He was built like a mountain, arms thick in muscles, broad-shouldered, and an impressive head of hair. Despite his overall physique, his hair was a contentious point for him, a dark brown like his late mother's, which, alongside his facial features, made him look strangely unrelated to his father. As a consequence, many who did not know him assumed ignorance of his parentage. This, however, was in contrast to his brother, Bjorn Bjornsson, named after his father, of course. Where Hakon's nose stayed flat and sat prominently on his face, Bjorn's nose curved up and mimicked his father's. Where Hakon's cheeks sat defined and his jaw splayed out, giving his head a boxy appearance, Bjorn's puffed slightly, giving his face a resemblance to that of a young chipmunk. Bjorn was also fairly solidly built, though nothing like his brother. He was young, only 12, and stood a good deal shorter than Hakon. His muscles were defined for someone so young, but were nowhere near developed enough to allow him to stand his ground against his sibling. Because of this, Elvar preferred to not have them train against one another. Rather, they would duel Elvar, himself, and Oskar, one of Elvar's sons, who was a similar age to Bjorn. However, they had gotten into a fight just before training, something about stealing breakfast, and had demanded that Elvar allow them to fight each other. As the prince's demand, the words he had said drifted through his mind. Why in Eric's name did he say that? He didn't like the idea at the time, and looking at the two now that they were in training garrisons, round shields and axes in their hands, it pained Elvar that he had allowed them to do so. He always felt this way when he allowed the two to fight. Bjorn would easily lose against his brother, and Hakon wouldn't even consider holding back against the younger prince. The two princes looked at each other. Elvar could see the anger in each brother's eyes, clouding their combat senses. Prince Bjorn, shield up and out. Get into your bracing stance. If they were going to duel, they might as well do it properly. Prince Hakon, this isn't a bar fight, so no ramming or hair grabbing. That goes for you as well, Prince Bjorn. Elvar knew it wouldn't help, but it was worth a shot. Bjorn always went for the heaviest shield, so he ended up not being able to keep it steady for long, meaning he held it too close to his body, foregoing his fighting stances. Hakon, on the other hand, had the workings of a berserker in him, plowing through the practice shields and hacking the other trainees who lost their footing. It was an honorable title given to those with particular strength and skill. Bjorn adjusted his shield before shifting his foot to compensate for the changed center of mass. Hakon didn't change his position. The two had a long rivalry. Hakon was the next in line for the throne. Originally, he was the younger son to Jarl Bjorn's first son, Bjorn, but after he died, Hakon was the only one left to take over. Then the Jarl had his third son, and, ever the creative type, named this child Bjorn as well. The two boys continued to stare daggers at each other. Begin! In a stern and clear voice, Elvar began the duel. Hakon charged his younger brother and rammed his shield into Bjorn's. For a second, it looked like Bjorn might have held his footing, but the full weight of Hakon's bulk prevailed, knocking the prince on his back, the shield out to one side. Hakon moved to continue the duel by stomping on Bjorn's exposed chest before Elvar stepped in. That's enough, Hakon. You've already won. Hakon looked at Elvar with a glaring eye before walking away, not content with the quick victory he had just achieved. Elvar lowered himself to one knee and looked down at Bjorn. The young boy's breath was heavy despite the short duel. Nothing's broken. You're only winded, likely bruised. Elvar's tone was soft, but clearly lacking sympathy. When it comes to Bjorn's voice, I can't do a young version of the Skyrim guard voice, so I'm just going to speak normally for that. Sorry in advance. I almost managed to stand my ground this time, Bjorn sputtered out through pauses to take in air. Elvar didn't look impressed. He was right. Bjorn's shoulder was bruised. The edge of his shield had swung back into his shoulder from Hakon's charge. Not the worst he'd ever been injured during one of their duels, but it still hurt nonetheless. Go see Greta. She'll get you bandaged up. Then we can start your lesson. Greta was the castle physician, a larger woman who had been a common herbalist before Jarl Bjorn had hired her to treat minor illnesses he had developed. Now she was a permanent resident in the castle. She had indulged herself a little too much when it came to the kitchen's pantries, and now her days were mostly spent treating the small injuries and aches of the princes. Bjorn made his way out of the training room and headed towards the castle infirmary where Greta worked. Infirmary? Infirmary where Greta worked. The castle of Gaultahas was the biggest building in the city, sitting atop a large hill with a deep surrounding moat. A large wooden wall sat inside the moat around the castle. 5 different towers, roughly equally distance apart, were built into the wall, with an additional 2 closer towers that made up the gatehouse. A bridge led from the gatehouse over the moat into the castle ground, a large flattened area of land that housed the castle stables, barracks, a number of extra housing for both civilians and slaves, and a few silos for storage. The whole area was also surrounded by its own wall and gatehouse, with this being the one that led into the wider city. The corridor that Bjorn walked through had a long row of windows that he often looked out on his way through the castle. While his room had its own windows, and there were plenty of spaces he could view the city, he liked this corridor the best. The river Fjord ran alongside much of the western ridge of the city, and as such all the city's ports were stationed there. Bjorn enjoyed watching as the many types of ship coming and going from that spot. Of course, at this age, his attention span wouldn't allow him to sit and watch boats moving around all day, but for the short minute it took to walk down the corridor, it made Bjorn quite happy. As he passed, he noticed something peculiar. Different to the wide-bodied ships that he normally saw, this ship was long and slimmer than the ships of merchants that often came to Gaultahas. Its sides were lined with shields, not unlike raiders that came to and from the city to sell their plunder, but its bow was decorated with a large serpentine head, and it was adorned with two flags on its mast. The first was the flag of Aramis, and the flag of Bjorn's family house. It was a dark green, the colour of the tree mosses that grew within the island's forest. Upon it stood three boars, sewn in yellow thread and silk, so that they resembled gold. Bjorn knew this flag well. It hung from the city's walls, lined the chambers and corridors of the castle, and flew from atop every ship mast. Despite many of the ships not belonging to the royal family, the reason to fly the Aramis flag was a sign of loyalty. It told the dock patrols that the ship wasn't from a foreign party or attacker. Of course, the patrols checked each ship for proof. However, the flag allowed them to moor the locals first and to know who needed to be kept under watch until they had paid their mooring fee. Most ships also had their own flag. Those owned by merchants had the company's flag, some symbol often with the name of the company, owners, or a motto, or the owner's clan. Few raiding ships sold their goods in Gaultahas and had their own flags, such as animals and birds. Few raiding ships sold their goods in Gaultahas had their own flags. Animals, such as birds, fish, and livestock, in simple block colors on the background. This one, however, was different. Despite its smaller size, in comparison, it stood out compared to the Gaultahas flag. Its background was golden, dyed silk that shimmered as it reflected in the sun. Sewn into the flag's design with red threads was a cross. On top, sewn into the flag's design with red threads was a cross, of which its sides spread to section the flag into four separate quarters. The top right and bottom left quarters held a well-known Sunderland symbol, the spear and shield of Harold Spearthane and Joran Shieldthane, the two twin war gods of the northern regions. These combined was the universal symbol for mercenaries in Sunderland, as opposed to the lone spear, which was a symbol of raiders and armies marching for war, and the lone shield, which was adopted amongst the ranks of the royal hussars and armies on patrol, using the god symbol to communicate their jobs. The top left and bottom right, however, were symbols strikingly unfamiliar to Bjorn. Bjorn's face scrunched up as he squinted, trying to get a better view of the flag. An abstracted foreign bird, perhaps, and a small abstracted sun with a face. Bjorn continued to look down over the docks of the fleet and new ships. As far as he was concerned, Greta could wait. Bjorn doubled his pace. I made Bjorn a verb. Bjorn doubled his pace and jogged down the corridor to the main hall of the castle. If anyone knew of the ship's origins, it would likely be the head dockman, and at this time of day, that would place him within Gaultahas, discussing details of bureaucracy to Jarl Bjorn. The captain of the ship made his way through the muddy streets of Gaultahas towards its capital building. Halfdan was a typical man from Sunderland. He was tall, with skin somewhat darker than the average in the area due to his heritage, but not noticeably so, and his figure was well muscled, with a head of slightly darker hair. What made him stand out from the crowds of Gaultahas was the stylings that he had fashioned himself. His hair was cut short in the style of Aurum Mil. That's not how you spell that at all. Aureum military, and his beard was cut squarish and with metal and clay beads decorating the ends, in contrast to the more simple fashion of Sunderland's, whose beards weren't cut and instead were decorated with braids and the occasional wood or ceramic bead. The backs of his hands were decorated with tattoos depicting foreign numbers, and his clothes used threads with silken trimmings that could not be found within many weeks' voyages from the Sunderland shores. Okay, so the man made his way through the tall wooden wall that surrounded the old Motte Bailey. It had once been the entirety of Gaultahas, with the castle at the top of the artificial hill now much larger than its original footprint. Where the old town had once been, it was replaced with the barracks, forges, and stables of the Jarl's Huskarls and standing levy. Halfdan made his way up to the wooden stairs towards the main doors of the castle, which were being flanked by two of the Jarl's Huskarls. Halfdan was halted by Jarl Bjorn's guards. The Jarl is currently partaking in dealings with Dockmaster Ferguson. Halfdan studied the Huskarl that stood before him. The man was tall, heavily built, and wore a large green gambeson tunic over a chain halberd. His left hand held up a large round shield painted with the green flag of Aramis. The shield was a center grip, in the standard Sunderland style, The edges tapered out so that you were to strike at it with your weapon. Okay. Fuck, I hate these big blocks of text. I can barely read them. Ugh, why'd I write things? I need new glasses. Fuck, okay. The man was tall, heavily built, and wore a large green gambeson tunic over a chain hauberk. His left hand held a large round shield painted with the green flag of Aramis. The shield was center grip in the standard Sunland style, the edges tapering out so that if you were to strike it, your weapon could be caught, potentially leaving you unarmed. In his other hand, he held a long-shafted winged spear. Traditionally known as a boar spear, the head of the weapon had two protruding wing-like structures jutting out either side of the neck, with the spear head attached to the varnished dark wooden shaft. On his head, the Huscarl wore steel dome-like helmet with two large oval eye holes that made the helmet look like that of an owl. On the sides were two attached metal plates that covered the Huscarl's ears and cheeks. These metal plates were turned upwards on their leather attachments, so that they rested at the side of his temples, resembling small wings like in depictions of Storian and Skjaldmey, warrior women under the command of the goddess Jorn Shieldbane. The door opened with some force. An older man, dressed in the clothes of a dockworker, stormed out, tailed by two younger men in similar loose-fitting tunics and thick woolen jerkins that protected their bodies from the freezing river water that they worked on. The elder of the three scowled at Halfdan, who gave an insincere smile as the dockworkers left. The Huscarls that had followed the dockworkers out stopped outside the door, one hand dangling to their sides and the other holding their shields, with their one-handed axes holstered in leather loops that attached to their belts, and their winged spears attached to a leather strap that hooked around their shoulders. The Huscarl that had blocked Halfdan's entrance spoke up. Jarl Bjorn Gunnarsson will see you now. Halfdan's smile faded into a neutral grin as the Huscarl led him into the throne room. It was a considerably sized hall, once a dining hall. However, the court's expansion had forced the Jarl to upgrade, and Jarl Bjorn had decided that this would make an excellent place to discuss matters of a ruling nature. For the people of Sunland, it was a grand palace. The walls were predominantly made of varnished pine logs. These were supported by a smaller stone wall that reached slightly higher than the average man. Large load-bearing pillars supported the ceiling beams. Each was intricately carved, with engravings of serpents twisting over and under each other, depictions of mountains that wrapped around the pillar's entirety, and waves ridden by armor-clad warriors. The carvings were done in the Broa style, one where designs are carved deeply into the wood to better depict depth. At the top of each pillar sat 4 wooden carved dragons' heads, identical to those depicted as figureheads on the Sunnish warships. The roof itself also curved inwards, designed to resemble that of an upturned ship, which likely was the original structure before the castle was built around it, and years of abuse would have required it to be fixed and parts completely replaced. Iron candle holders jutted out of walls, giving a warm glow to the building. The only other light source was from a few small rectangular windows that sat far beyond each, and gave in just enough light to be able to see the room clearly. The centerpiece of the whole room was the throne of Aramis, carved from an oak and with the same engravings that patterned the rest of the hall. The back stood higher than any living man would ever require, and was more of a simple excuse to add more visible designs. Supposedly built for the ancestor of Jarl Bjorn's household, a man of mythic size and proportion named Bjorndri, who had discovered the island and whose grandchildren had conquered it, naming it Sunland for reasons that still plagued the Jarls of the island to this day. Not that the throne did belong to this ancestor. It was built far too long after Bjorndri's death to truly be built for him. However, the story was an intriguing one, and gave credence to Jarl Bjorn's lineage as a direct descendant of the mythic hero. Are you done ogling, Captain Halfdan? Jarl Bjorn's thick accent and deep voice resonated around the hall. Halfdan hadn't been. He had seen more impressive castles the world over, but thought best not to tell that to the Jarl. The car alarm just went off. My apologies, Jarl Bjorn Gunnarsson. Halfdan bowed, stopping himself before saying any more. The Huscarl hadn't introduced Halfdan to the Jarl, and as such Halfdan wasn't meant to say anything unless directly addressed, a mistake he often made. The man who sat on the throne, which overlooked the hall, was a giant amongst nobility. His shoulders sat where most men's heads reached, and even while sitting down he had a heft and threatening build to him. The Jarl's facial features almost seemed out of place when looking at his body. The head on which the crown of Aramis sat was dull red, not unlike that of a sword left out in water. His hair hung down to his shoulders, and strands of silver broke up the ginger outline. His beard was a similar story, red and silver, with thin plaits of woven hair. The ends of his beard reached far, covering his neck and part of his chest, and covering the collection of dark blue tattoos that decorated the Jarl's body. He looked old for his age. Despite only being in his late 30s, his eyes seemed to sag slightly. Lines spread across his forehead and chin, though many of the wrinkles he wore were evidently smile lines he had acquired over the years, rather than all being the responsibility of age. At the Jarl's side was a smaller man, though no less impressive in build to any of the other housecarls. "Captain Halfdan of the Divinis Draki." The speaker paused before carrying on with his introduction. "'Tis my honor to introduce you to our lord, Jarl Bjorn Gunnarsson, son of Gunnar, ruler of Fjellsburg, Blaklabur, Gaultahas, and the kingdom of Aramis." The Huskarl stopped, almost looking like he was trying to remember if anything else was to come after the title, before being satisfied that there wasn't. "Please, Captain Halfdan, call me Gunnarsson." The way Gunnarsson spoke rang with familiarity. "It would be an honor, Gunnarsson," Halfdan responded quickly, to avoid allowing his smile to crease across his face. Gunnarsson began a healthy chuckle, which evolved into a drum-like laugh. As both men relinquished their attempts to hold back their smiles, Gunnarsson stood from his throne and walked towards Halfdan, grabbing his hand and pulling him for a bear-like hug. "By Eric's beard, you've aged," Gunnarsson cheerfully recounted Halfdan's flaws. "And you still have no sense of diplomacy." Halfdan felt a lump in his throat. Talking to the nobility in such terms was not something he had been allowed to do for some time. "And my gods, are those grey hairs?" "Yes, I'm afraid I've been afflicted by the terrible illness of time that all men must one day suffer." Halfdan's eyes watched Gunnarsson's face. His smile had diminished somewhat, and the crow's feet that had been so prominent were turned downwards before his features regained their cheerful appearance. Gunnarsson continued to stand. "So then, what brings you back to Aramis? Surely with the size of the fleet the document says you've brought to port, you don't need protection." Gunnarsson's voice changed from friendly to more serious. Halfdan, seeing the switch in atmosphere, returned to his more diplomatic tone. "No, your highness. My crew and I were simply looking for a place to dock, resupply, and sell some of the treasures we procured through our travels." The mention of treasures seemed to pique Gunnarsson's interest. "The tale is long, and fewer parts have as much action as I would like. However, my previous employer suddenly decided to swear fealty to someone who cared as much for me as I did for him." Halfdan paused at this, adding emphasis to his words. "The pay was good enough. However, once he no longer had need of mercenaries, the whole fleet of dragon ships was told to put down their oars and axes and pick up farming equipment." Gunnarsson listened carefully. "But you were under the command of Baldric the Slayer, were you not? I can't imagine him willingly swearing fealty to anyone, let alone a foreigner." "He was afflicted by the same illness as all men, as you so eloquently put it. He wished for a legacy. Conquering the heart of the Aryan Empire seemed like the best way to go about it. That is, until after 3 failed attempts and the death of Baldric that we decided to try a different approach. Emperor Bonitus decided that we weren't going to give up, so he offered to hire us as his mercenaries for a war against the Okrits." Halfdan saw the puzzled look on Gunnarsson's face and decided to clarify. "A kingdom of Hebraskan people from the east. We served with Aurum. Our new commander, Captain Erling, was given a position in the Emperor's court for his service. Captains such as myself were given land to farm." "Sounds like a victory to me," Gunnarsson cut in, disrupting Halfdan's story. "Why would you give up land such as these?" Halfdan game governed. Hey, all these fucking names. Why did I write this book in Swedish? Halfdan gave Gunnarsson a weak smile. "A tale I'd be honored to share with you in time. However, I have had a long voyage and would like to rest for the time being. Perhaps we could discuss it at a later time." Halfdan wasn't lying. He was obviously worn from his travels and needed the rest, and now that he mentioned it, Gunnarsson was obliged to offer it to him.
Feel free. I'd be happy to have the servants prepare a room for you.
Halfdan bowed before Gunnarsson, who walked towards his throne and sat. Your kindness is appreciated, my lord. If it wouldn't be too... Halfdan didn't get to finish his request. The door to the side of the hall that had connected to an escape corridor opened, and Halfdan saw a young boy barge in. His hair was a dark orange, his figure was broad for his age, and he was wearing the garb and training gambeson of a prince. The boy called out, Father, did you see the ships that arrived in the dock this morning? His face bore an expression in the way all children do when they know they're doing something they probably shouldn't.
In Eric's name, Bjorn, can't you see that I'm in the middle of a discussion?
Gunnarsson lashed out at the child. Evidently, this wasn't the first time the child had done this, but something else had caught Halfdan's attention. My apologies, Jarl Gunnarsson, but would this happen to be your son, Bjorn? Halfdan was somewhat shocked and a little disturbed to see the child. Gunnarsson's head turned back to Halfdan, but his eyes remained staring at his son.
Yes, this is Prince Bjorn, the royal pain of the family.
The words were spoken slightly more forcefully than Halfdan would have expected, though the young Prince Bjorn didn't seem to be too taken aback by them. Gunnarsson sighed.
Bjorn, this is Captain Halfdan of the ship, the...
Gunnarsson's gestured to Halfdan to finish the sentence for him.
The Divina Streki.
Halfdan filled the blanks for him, his face going white as if he'd seen a ghost. Gunnarsson nodded, thanks at Halfdan.
He is the owner of the fleet of ships that pulled into port today with the golden and red flags.
Gunnarsson paused for a couple of seconds.
Why aren't you training with Elvar? Your lessons surely aren't over already.
Bjorn's eyes looked down at the floor. I dueled Hakon. He beat me. I was going to see Greta. The boy turned to leave the room.
Stop!
Gunnarsson called out, causing Bjorn to freeze. Bjorn turned around. My apologies, father. May I be excused? Gunnarsson nodded. Bjorn almost ran out of the room once permission was granted.
Sorry about that. So what were you saying?
Gunnarsson turned his full attention back to Halfdan, who remained white as a sheet, or as pale as his tanned complexion would allow.
I'm sorry, my lord, but I must ask again. Are you sure that was Pince?
Pince! Fuck me! Swedish! Oh, yeah, I need water. Okay, I've got some water, so I shouldn't keep fucking up.
I'm sorry, my lord, but I must ask again. Are you sure that was Prince Bjorn?
Halfdan's question put a puzzled look upon Gunnarsson's face before realization dawned. Gunnarsson's face dropped.
Oh, of course. You would have left by then.
His eyes seemed to sag, and he looked as if he had aged before Halfdan's eyes.
Bjorn was always ill. Something he shared with his mother.
Beatrice, Halfdan mumbled, realizing for the first time that both thrones beside Gunnarsson were empty.
He died 2 years after you left, around 8 years of age. At the same time, my son Hakon was born. It was a hard birth, and Beatrice did not survive. I later remarried, and 4 years after Hakon, my third son was born, though his mother did not live beyond his 5th winter.
Gunnarsson looked unresponsive, his face grey, reliving the memory. Halfdan's face grew concerned. So... He paused. Oh my god, I'm burping now. Great.
So, he paused, you named your third son Bjorn to remember him.
Halfdan didn't quite know how to feel. He was a close friend to Gunnarsson at the time, and had acted as the first Bjorn's teacher, almost becoming like a second father to the young child, teaching him the very basics of courtly etiquette and other concepts that the children of nobility were encouraged to learn at an early age.
And the second son you mentioned, Hakon,
he is next in line to the throne. Something clicked within Halfdan's mind.
My lord, you must realize how dangerous it will be for Bjorn once Hakon comes of age.
Gunnarsson looked up from the floor to focus on Halfdan.
Dangerous? This castle is the safest place in the Ramos, if not Sunland as a whole. Who would wish to harm Bjorn here?
Gunnarsson said in a rhetorical manner. Gunnarsson said in a rhetorical manner.
Besides, Hakon has been of age for a year now, and I've seen no issues come of it.
Halfdan looked at Gunnarsson, trying to gauge just how truthful the statement was. Very well, my lord. Then, with your permission, I will take my leave. If one of your servants could show me where I'll be staying, I would be most appreciative. Halfdan tried to maneuver away from the topic of succession as quickly as possible. Gunnarsson's smile grew back once more, though he didn't seem to lose the years he had gained speaking of his first child.
Very well. You are free to leave. Frok, escort Captain Halfdan to the servant quarters and have one of them lead him to the guest rooms.
One of the Huskarls that stood behind Halfdan let out a quick response and led the captain out to the throne room and down a series of corridors. Halfdan thought back to the conversation and the topic of the young prince.
Don't get involved. He's not the same Bjorn. And even if he was, it's not your responsibility.
He just have to hope that everything worked out as Gunnarsson had planned. If he had planned anything at all. As he did so, Halfdan thought of the fabled curse of which the Jarls of Sunland were plagued, and with a saddened whisper he spoke yet again to himself.
Don't get involved.
Ah!